Welcome to the video on the twofold attack. You know how to move the pieces, you know how much each piece is worth, and you have learned about the basics of attack and defense. Now it's time to add a little layer of difficulty to that knowledge. Throughout a game of chess, you're going to be faced with situations where multiple pieces can take each other. And in that same vein, situations where more than one piece is attacking and ganging up on another. And that is what is meant by a twofold attack. So let's take a look at an example. Very simple position here on the board, right? We have a situation where white has three pieces, all of which are attacking the same focal point, in this case, the black knight on e6. In chess, we actually call this a target square, which definition is just a square where more than one of someone's pieces is attacking. So when faced with the situation of a twofold attack, and it is your move or it's your opponent's move, you have to do what's called calculation. You have to think several moves ahead in order to determine what or if it's a good idea to capture the piece or pawn on a given square where the pieces are ganging up, right? And there's often not necessarily a right answer, or you're not forced to do this, but it could be a good idea because twofold attacks often lead to the result of winning material, or put simply, gaining points. Okay, so let's take a look at this example on the board, and it's white's move. All right, the first step, of course, is to identify where or what is the piece that is being attacked more than once. We've just done that. That's the knight on e6. So then the decision is, A, do we capture it? And B, how do we capture and take it so as to make sure that this exchange results in our favor as far as white is concerned? So what do you think you would do in this position? Is taking the knight a good idea here? The answer is yes, it is. All right. Now, the second question, which piece should you capture the knight with? The bishop or the rook? The answer is the bishop. Okay? And the reason why is because we're going to think more than one move ahead here. All right? We see that black's knight is defended by this pawn on f7. Okay? So we know that if one of our pieces takes the knight on e6, the black pawn is going to recapture whatever piece I choose that lands on e6, right? So then you just have to evaluate and ask yourself, well then which piece is worth more, my rook or my bishop? And the answer, of course, is the rook, because the rook is worth 5 points, whereas the bishop is worth 3. Okay? So if you put all those ideas together, you'll see that after bishop takes knight and pawn takes bishop, the rook can now capture the pawn on e6. And what has happened after those past two moves? We have gained 1 point in value, right? Because while we have lost our bishop, we have received in exchange a knight plus a pawn, which is a 1 point advantage for us. All right, so very simplistically, this is what a twofold attack is, and you are going to be faced with these decisions all the time during a course of chess. So it's just about doing a little bit of counting and calculation and making sure to understand the tactical sequence that goes into it, along with making sure to keep the piece values in your head, what's being captured and what's being gained in the process. So we can take a simple position like this and make a slight modification. All right, so in this case, you'll see that a bishop has appeared here on a2. And so I'll ask you the same question. Where is the twofold attack? And secondly, is it a good idea to go through with it? looking at the position, you might have noticed that the bishop on a2 actually makes a big difference. Okay? Because if we do the exact same thing, bishop takes knight. Now let's say the bishop takes the bishop. Do we want to go ahead and take this bishop with our rook? All right? So we still have a twofold attack on the bishop, right? Because both of our rooks are lined up attacking this piece. It's only defended once by this pawn on f7, so we're going to end up taking two pieces for our one. But remember, just as importantly, we have to keep in mind the point value associated with each piece. Okay, so if we were to follow through with this twofold attack and capture the bishop on e6, we are losing our rook, which is worth 5 points, but only gaining a bishop and a pawn, which is worth 4 points. So this makes this exchange and following through with this twofold attack, from white's perspective, not a good idea. Let's go on to the next example. Okay, so it's obviously important to first introduce the topic in a very simplified situation, but now we're going to take a look at a few actual game positions that you could be faced when you're playing, and we can identify where these twofold attacks occur and how to evaluate them properly. Okay, so let's pretend we have this position. And for our purposes, we're going to be thinking about white's perspective for every example, just to keep it easy. Okay, so the first step is to identify where the twofold attack occurs. And the second step is to think about whether or not you should go through with the capture of that piece or pawn that is being attacked more than once, and whether or not the resulting exchanges are in your favor. All right, so in this case, the pawn on f7 is our target square because both our bishop and knight are attacking it. So that's step one. Step two, if we follow through with taking this, what happens? Okay, so there's going to be a series of exchanges and captures. Hopefully you were able to evaluate to this point. What has happened in the past two moves is that white has received a rook and a pawn, and black in return has received two pieces of white's, right? The bishop and the knight. Now, at face value, by thinking about it purely in terms of points, you might think that this exchange was rather equal, right? Because a rook plus a pawn is 6 points, and a bishop plus a knight is 6 points also. However, in certain situations, and usually, especially in the middle game, which it is in this case, right? The two pieces, the bishop and the knight, are more valuable relative to the rook and the pawn. So, unless you have a really good reason for doing so, like you win more material, for example, it's generally best to avoid this exchange of two minor pieces for a rook and a pawn. That's a common misconception. All right. However, in this position, what if you play this move, queen to h5? Okay, because now you're adding a third piece to the attack on the f7 pawn. Black would have to defend it somehow. So let's say black plays pawn to d5. And now we have another situation with the twofold attack, right? This pawn on d5 is attacked twice by my pawn on e4 and bishop on c4. So there's the twofold attack. We, of course, have to identify how many pieces our opponent has defending it. And what you'll see is that black has two pieces defending it. Okay, so in our heads, we can already determine that if all the exchanges were to happen, we would not be ending up resulting in a positive outcome, because this would just be a relatively even trade, right? So to walk through it, because it's just 2v2, If all of these things capture each other, then all that's happened is really you just helped black's queen develop to a nice centralized square, and neither side has really gained material. But hold on. Hopefully you spotted that in this situation, white has a much better option than taking this pawn on d5. You might have noticed that because the queen is now on h5, not only was it applying pressure to this f7 pawn, but it was simultaneously also attacking this pawn on h7, which, lo and behold, when white takes it, this is actually checkmate, right? Because the king is in check, it can't move anywhere, and it can't capture the queen on h7 because it is protected by the knight on g5. Okay, so a little more complicated, but this is just an example to show that you can have a situation with multiple twofold attacks at the same time, and it's up to you to evaluate and sort through all the complications. Okay, let's take a look at another example. Again, white to play. What do you think you should do here? Identify the twofold attack. We have the queen on b3 plus the knight on g5, attacking this pawn on e6. How many defenders does black have on it? Only one. Therefore, if either piece were to take this pawn on e6, it would result in a profitable exchange for us as white, right? Because with only one defender, black could not capture this whatever piece on e6 without losing material, right? So for example, if the knight were to take on e6, black of course would not want to capture that knight on e6 because it is defended by the queen, and obviously losing a queen for a knight is not good. Similarly, if you wanted to capture the pawn with the queen, right, you would just be winning this pawn, because after the subsequent queen trade, none of black's pieces can take this knight on e6, so you've come up one pawn ahead. Adding a layer of complication, let's take this, for example. Let's think about it from black's perspective. It's black's move, okay? So we have a situation here where there are two separate pieces attacking two separate pieces of white's, right? So kind of a dynamic situation here. But one capture is okay, whereas the other is a huge blunder, which is not very good. All right, so which one is which? And you have to be careful when thinking about this in your games. You may see that if the bishop were to take the bishop on b3, this would be all in good, except your poor queen would be hanging on d7, and now white would gladly snatch that off for free, right? Instead of the simple and more obvious recapture of the bishop that just took on b3, we have to be alert and aware of all possibilities, especially when there are captures on the board. Okay? So be on the lookout for situations like this. So as a result, in this position, if black were to take anything, the correct option would be to take the queen first, right? Then followed by the bishop. And these are just a bunch of even exchanges. Okay? So same situation here. From white's perspective, what do you think the best move here is in this position? We identify the twofold attack. The bishop on g5 and the rook on d1 are attacking the rook on d8. Is it a good idea to take this rook on d8? And if so, with which piece should you capture with? The answer is with the bishop, because the bishop is less valuable in terms of points than the rook. Right? So we often always want to lead with our least valuable piece when it comes to twofold attacks, because if we lose that piece, it's worth less compared to our better pieces, right? So after, let's say the knight recaptures, okay, we've won a rook for a bishop, that's called the winning of the exchange, right? But we would not want to continue with the capture here because we would just be giving that exchange back to black. We would be losing a rook for a knight. Okay, let's take this position from white's perspective. Again, very similar structure. The question is, which way should white recapture this bishop on b3? With the pawn on a2 or with the knight on d2? The answer is the pawn on a2. Why? Because you may have found that if the knight were to capture, this would enable black to have a twofold attack on the rook here on d1, right? Because we see that there is what's called a battery, which is where two pieces on the same file or rank are ganged up against a piece, giving a twofold attack, right? And this would be very, very profitable for black because there is only one white piece defending this rook. So this would be a very favorable exchange. After queen takes d1 and the trade of queens, black is now up a full rook for nothing. Couple last examples. The final, more complicated form of a twofold attack, or a tactical sequence involving calculation, if you will, is the idea of not just only one capture being correct, or a twofold attack involving a loss of material, but the concept that often to win material, you may have to give up, quote-unquote, points first. And we call this a sacrifice. A sacrifice in chess is a move that temporarily loses you material, but hopefully in exchange gets you something better in the form of positional domination or greater material in subsequent moves. Okay? So the sacrifice is losing material on purpose in order to have greater gain in a few more moves down the road. What can this look like as far as twofold attacks are concerned? Well, look at this position. Okay, we have a twofold attack here on this pawn on f7, right? And unlike one of the previous positions that we went over together, this king is not nicely castled here on g8. So in this case, the pawn is really vulnerable, right? So black can't simply play a move like pawn to h6 because the white knight will simply capture on f7, and this king cannot take the knight on f7 due to it being an illegal move, of course. Okay, so black has to stop this twofold attack somehow. Let's say black plays pawn to d5. White captures. Okay. Instead of playing the move bishop takes d5, which is just a simple trade, giving up a bishop for a knight and kind of helping with black's development, there is a very famous sacrifice in this position, actually, which I will show you. Knight takes f7, striking on the target square. And then when the king takes back, there is this move queen to f3 check. All right. When we attack two pieces or squares or pawns simultaneously in chess, we call this a fork, which is one of the fundamental chess tactics. It'll be covered later on, but just to give you a heads up, a form of a twofold attack is called a fork. All right, and a fork is very powerful because often it wins us material. All right, and here we can see that because of this twofold attack, if the king moves somewhere, white can simply capture because of the twofold attack on the d5 square. Black only has one piece defending that, so if he were to take now, that would be a really bad idea because he would lose his queen. And similarly, if black were to try to block the check with his queen, for instance, then of course white can simply just take this knight on d5 with check, and he's regained his material. What does all this mean? Well, although it was pretty exciting and maybe a little complicated, what you'll notice is that after all this, white has actually won a pawn, right? So how did this happen? Well, he originally took a pawn on f7, he lost a knight, and then after this check, he got the knight back, right? So that's an example of where you're giving up something more valuable than the initial piece that you captured. So a knight for a pawn, 3-1. But we get that knight back the following move. So what this means is we have netted ourselves 1 point advantage, along with, of course, a better position. All right, final example, just to kind of cap it off. This is the most complicated one. See how you guys do with this. So there are going to be situations where you'll need to recognize the potential for twofold attacks, right? And as I mentioned, one of the easiest ways to identify a twofold attack is the presence of a battery, right? Which is where, two or more of your pieces are lined up in a row, either on a given rank or a file, pressuring that line, right? So in this case, from Black's perspective, we see that all three of the major pieces are lined up on this D file, okay, against White's position. So in our minds, we need to be thinking about using the power of that battery to execute a twofold attack. Okay? If you kind of envision what this could look like, here is a very powerful variation that could happen in the game. This is in no way forced, but to give you an example of combining everything we've learned. So multiple twofold attacks, the idea that, one capture may be correct whereas another isn't, and the idea of a sacrifice where we're giving up something of more value first to achieve something better in return. This all comes together here. Okay? So, from Black's perspective, we have a twofold attack on this pawn on e4, right? The pawn on d5 and the knight on f6. Now, White has ample defenders of that pawn on e4. 4, in fact, right? All 4 of these guys are protecting this pawn on e4. So, although we might capture once, you don't have to always follow through, right? Just because you capture once, there's nothing forcing you to continue with those captures. The purpose of pawn takes pawn is to further open up this battery down the d file. It's not really to win material on the e4 square, okay? So let's pretend that White captures with the knight, which in this case, as you'll see, is not the best idea. Black decides to trade on e4. Right now, of course, if White were to recapture with the pawn instead, Black would not want to do this, right? Because that would be losing a knight for a pawn, which is an unfavorable exchange. After knight takes knight, knight takes knight. And now, which way should White recapture? With the queen or with the pawn? The answer is definitely with the queen. Okay? So hopefully you guys got that right. The reason why is because after pawn takes knight, what can Black do here? The answer, queen takes d1 check. A very powerful temporary sacrifice, right? We are giving up our queen for a rook initially, but we are getting something much better in return. And you may have seen, because of this twofold attack crashing through against the target square of d1, after the bishop takes the queen, right? Well, first of all, it's pretty easy to see why this works, right? Black has 1, 2, 3 pieces attacking the rook, whereas White only has 1, 2 defenders. Right, so at the bottom line, it's a matter of training yourself to focus on move-by-move calculation, counting the number of pieces attacking and defending the given square or piece that's being attacked multiple times, and then just evaluating piece value at the end of it. Okay, so after queen takes rook, bishop takes queen, rook takes d1, White is in a world of trouble because the black rook on d1 is giving check to the White king. There is no way for White to save himself except for blocking with the queen. after which black takes. And what has happened? You should do your count. You will notice that black is up a full piece for nothing, right? We have one rook to one rook. We have one knight to one knight. We have 7 pawns to 7 pawns. However, black has 2 bishops to only 1 for white, and black is winning. Okay, so this is the video demonstrating twofold attacks. Be sure to practice the examples associated with this video, and thank you for watching.